I realized. And so we have an application that I can put in the chat box too. And so again, you guys are welcome to come to the rest of the fall workshops, but if you're also interested in the mentoring program that we're going to have in the winter semester, we encourage you guys to apply before November 4th. And there's also more information on the website.
Hi, I hope you all are doing well. Thank you so much for that great introduction, Annika. So one thing I do want to emphasize is that our winter program is for Michigan students, because we do that in person. These fall sessions, we really do welcome everybody, and especially I want to point out to you our next session on the 21st, which is applying to grad school. So for those of you who might be thinking about that, definitely do not feel shy about signing up and coming on by for that, because we hope it will be helpful for you. So first, I'm just going to kind of start about this idea of how do we generate new knowledge. So when you are in your classrooms and you're finding out about the stuff that got you interested in psychology or neuroscience or something like that to begin with, like, where does that information come from, right? Those textbooks weren't handed down to us from on high. And so instead, that knowledge comes from people like you and me and all of us together, like being in labs, going out into the world, doing experiments, doing studies, and trying to figure out how the world and how people work. And that's actually how I fell in love with psychology. Was, I started off as a research assistant in the lab as a high school student, in fact, and it was just blowing me away that I was like, wait, you mean I can like find out how people work and I can ask any question about the mind and brain and thinking, as long as I can convince somebody it's important enough to give me money to do it, I can figure it out. Okay, sign me up. So I hope that you have the same enthusiasm. So the first thing, and sometimes the hardest part, is choosing your topic and your area of interest. I personally find this the most difficult because there's a lot of stuff that's really interesting, so narrowing it down. But it's a good idea to at least try to do one thing at a time. And then there's usually other people who have at least thought about this. So we want to figure out what we already know about the topic. So you're going to research the background literature. In most cases, that's often written up in these journal articles. Then you're going to refine your topic. So there's a lot of things we know, but everything that we know leads to new questions, leads to new things that we want to know more about. How does this thing fit together with that thing? And then we're going to design a study, and we figure out which methods we're going to use to answer our question. And for some of us, that might mean doing research with animals. In other cases, it might mean bringing people into the lab and taking different kind of biological assays from them, or having them do surveys. Other times it's having them do surveys online, or it might be, taking pictures of their brain while it's in action or while it's still. There are many, many different kinds. And again, that's one of the fun things about psychology, is all the different methods that we can use. Then we're going to do the study, get our data, try to figure out what that data is telling us. And then we're going to share our findings, again, often by writing them up papers or doing poster presentations that somebody else is going to use when they're doing their background info and trying to figure out, what is the next part of it. So each one of us gets to add a couple little bricks to the building of knowledge. And depending on the topic, we might already know a lot about the subject, or it might be a relatively new area of research, or one that's been neglected a lot. So, I do research in attention and memory, and there's a lot of things that we already know about that, and that gives me a chance to build on it. But then on the other hand, we know a lot less about how these things interact, let's say, with social functions or with emotional aspects of things. We know a little bit that we can build on, that how those differ across different groups. And so when we're in the little or less knowledge position, we're often doing exploratory research. So it's just kind of, even figuring out what are the right questions to ask. What is the world trying to tell us? What seems to be important that we want to go after? When we know a lot about something, it's sort of, okay, now we know what the problem is. We know what the phenomena is that we want to study. Now we're going to try to figure out what's causing it or how we can change it. And likewise, there's all different kinds of research. So there's, oops. Sorry, I have somebody trying to call me through this, and that's not working so well. There we go. So basic research that's usually trying to figure out really basic functions of how does something work? What is an underlying mechanism? And in many cases, that's animal research, but it can also be human experimental research. So how does thing A cause thing B, or how is thing A related to thing B? And what is going on naturally without trying to necessarily push it around in ways that are going to then have implications for patients and so on. We just want to figure out the basic aspect of it. So in some ways, if you think about NASA, why do we go to the moon? Well, because it's there, and because it's curious, we're curious creatures, and we want to know basic information about the world that's around us. In my case, it might be something like, well, why do you want to know about how this, why do you want to know about how this particular neurotransmitter system interacts with attention? Well, I want to know about that, just because it's an interesting thing to know about. But on the other hand, then we go to translational research. So this is now where we start to work to start applying these problems to people. So in my case, an example might be, well, I work with a person who does animal research as well. And that person can find out a lot more about how these brain systems work in animals, because we can just do work in animals that we can't do in people. And then we try to come up with a version that's sort of similar that we test in healthy people. And then we say, okay, can we put that version to put that information together? What's the really basic stuff that we would want to know before we even start trying to design a new drug to help treat people with Parkinson's disease? What are the things that we think this should target? So that's sort of the first step of moving from basic research to what's called translational research, is just trying to figure out, how do you go from that really simple knowledge to something that even conceptually could be applied in person? And then clinical research is saying, okay, we've designed this intervention, we've figured out how we think the mechanism should work. And then we say, okay, so let's actually put this information now into patients. Let's take that drug and test it in people and see, is it actually having the effects on a wide scale that we think it should have? And interestingly, it can also go the other way too. So some of you may have heard in the news, there was a little bit of a fuss over the summer about the idea that a certain class of drugs that is used to treat depression, called serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they don't actually necessarily work to treat depression in quite the same way that people had thought they did. It doesn't mean that they're not effective for depression. We know they're effective for depression. They work. We were just wrong about the mechanism. So that's actually now where we have to go back to the translational research and the basic research part and say, we know this has an effect. What is it? So the types of research methods that we use, and we often use a lot of them, even one sort of research project in psychology. So an experiment is just a method to determine cause and effect. So if I have you, so let's use a simple example. If I have you just count all the E's in every sentence that I say, are you going to remember more than if you try to summarize every sentence? A cross-sectional design. So this would be observing people at one point in time. Usually cross-sectional also means that we're comparing some kind of group. So in my work, it might be studying healthy people versus studying people with Parkinson's disease, or it might be studying young adults versus older adults. And we make comparisons then, but then all we can really do is talk about differences. We can't really say this is a change that's due to aging, or this is a change that's due to disease. If we want to do that, then we have to do what it's called longitudinal studies. So if I want to say I really want to be sure that this is due to the process of aging, then I would follow the same group of people from when they were 20 to when they were 30 to when they were 60. Likewise, I might then start with a group of healthy people, start with a really large group and say, okay, well, if we start with a large group of people who were in their 60s, there's a good chance that some percentage of them are going to develop Parkinson's disease. And then I look backwards and say, was there something different early on from the people who ultimately went on to develop Parkinson's disease versus those that didn't? Case studies, this is when you're interested in something that's relatively rare. So I don't know if any of you have heard the story of Phineas Gage. So Phineas Gage was the guy who, very unfortunately for him, got a railroad spike through his head, but fortunately for him, he lived. But he had very different emotional functioning, became a much less nice guy than he used to. So that then told us a lot about what the areas of his brain that were damaged were doing. It's not an experiment that we're likely to repeat. People would have a lot of problems with that. It's not something that we're going to do a longitudinal study on, but we take advantage of this really unique circumstance. And we try to infer some things from that then leads to studies from other methods. Behavioral, again, this is just observing people's behavior and physiology. What's your score on a test? How do you answer a survey? How do you respond when somebody comes up and talks to you? And then self-report, that is often survey kinds of research. How are you feeling today? Doing scales that ask you to rate your personality and things like that. We also can get different kinds of data. So the kind of work that I'm most familiar with is quantitative. So, we'll take different measurements of you. So what's your score on a test? What is the value that we get from your measure of brain function? And so in that case, we're usually trying to, get some information that will let us explain mechanisms, and that's usually more related to when we know a lot about something. Qualitative data is data that can't be quantified. So this is trying to understand what the problem is. So this is sort of going in, let's say, to a refugee camp and trying to understand the issues that people are having there with adjustment. You don't even necessarily know what are the right questionnaires or scales to give them. So instead you do interviews, you ask people about their experiences, you ask them what their difficulties are, you ask them how they are being able to be resilient. And then you go through and you look through those interviews and try to extract common themes from them and say, these look like the issues that are important here. Now maybe we can go back and try to do one of those other correlational or behavioral studies to figure out if the questions that we're generating from this qualitative research are really the ones we should be going after. So to summarize, we usually want to start off, by kind of having something that we're interested in, and then we start to see what information is already out there about the topic. And that helps us then decide what kind of question is the one that we want to ask. Do I still need to do some background work to figure out what's important and what the things are that I should be looking at? Or is knowledge developed enough to the point where I'm able to say, okay, I think I know what's happening here that's important. Now I want to figure out why. And again, am I doing basic research, or has enough basic research been done that I can now move to translational research and start saying, well, okay, let's think about how this might work in people or how this might work in a particular disorder. And then clinical research will sort of, really putting it to the test and saying, I want to see if this thing that I think works, that should work in principle, when I really put it to the test and, look at a lot of people and look at a lot of patients, does it have the effects that I want it to have? So again, that's going to determine the methods that we use to answer those questions, and that all in turn affects the kind of data that we want to collect. And so one of the reasons that we have so many methods in psychology research is that, psychology being the study of people and how they work both internally and with each other, it covers a lot of different areas. I would say it's probably one of the most complex, but also I think it makes it the most fun area of science. And so these are just the areas that we have represented here at the University of Michigan. So cognition and cognitive neuroscience, that's the kind of work I mostly do. Psychology and women's and gender studies. So how do some of the things that we have studied, in many cases that were often studied, let's face it, by old white guys, and old white guys are going to be interested in the questions that are relevant to old white guys. Well, let's try to be a little bit more expansive. Other people have different experiences. Let's think about, what kinds of perspective and lens that brings to it. Educational psychology, so you can think of that as being a more translational and clinical aspect of it. So what kinds of education are effective? What is going on in development and developmental psychology, which is another one of our areas, and how does that interact with what we're doing in schools? Personality and social contexts, that's an area where all of us are a little bit different. Some of that comes from genetics, some of it comes from our experience, and we're also then shaped, and we also shape by what's around us and who we're interacting with. Clinical psychology is the one that almost everybody knows about. And when you say that you're a psychologist, if you're not a clinical psychologist, you have to tell everybody that you're not one. So this is usually then, basically working with people who are in need of therapy and trying to help them work through some of their issues. Social psychology is basically how we interact with each other. Social work with psychology, so in some ways you can think of that as the more translational and applied version of social psychology. So social psychology is looking at the theoretical and at the mechanisms. Social work is looking at the translational and the clinical aspects. And then biopsychology, that's often work that's done with animals or looking at basic brain systems in humans. And that, again, is often really focused on the more experimental and mechanism aspects of it. And again, I think the most fun thing to do is to have a question that you're interested in one area and then find people in other areas who have a different perspective on it and collaborate with them. Okay, we will, do you want to take a break, Annika, or do you want to keep going?
Either way. Maybe
Okay, tell you what, do you guys want to vote? So give us a thumbs up if you want a break, and if not, we will just keep going.
I think we can keep going then.
Yeah, I think we've only got two for a break, so. Okay. And let's see. So now we'll talk about what it's like being in the lab and what your involvement is. So usually there's a little bit of a hierarchy in the lab and people do different jobs. So at the top of the lab is usually a principal investigator or PI. That's usually a faculty member. And so then as a faculty member, I will work both with graduate students and postdocs. And they are usually the ones who are often sort of leading a particular project. They will work with their PI to come up with the idea. And then there will be a lab manager. In some ways, the lab manager probably should be at the top of the hierarchy because they're the ones that keep everything going. But they manage a lot of the day-to-day business of the lab. So making sure that we have supplies ordered, making sure that we are keeping up with our emails to participants and our thank yous to them. And then undergraduate research assistants, one of the neat things about it is you get to interact with a number of different people. So often you'll be working primarily with a graduate student, and they'll be sort of the team leader and you're kind of learning as an apprentice with them. You'll also be working with the lab manager. So the lab manager might help you schedule your hours and make sure that you're hitting your goals. And even though we don't have the lines drawn here, you usually will end up interacting with your PI at least sometimes too, especially as you become more and more of a senior RA. So it's the other thing to keep in mind is that as you move through, you're probably going to start sort of drifting up on this hierarchy a little bit. So to begin with, you might only interact with your graduate student and a lab manager and be starting with some basic tasks. But if you continue on and you do something like a senior thesis and so on, then you're going to be working more like a graduate student and interacting a lot with your PI. So some examples of tasks that you might do as RA. So in my lab, you would be helping us set up the lab. I actually just had my whole lab renovated, and so everything got moved out. So now we get the fun of like trying to decide where to put everything into sort of a not quite brand new space, but it feels that way. Working with different populations. So people in my lab, they work with young adults, they work with older adults, they work with different patients. We've done some studies with kids, so you can get a lot of different experience there. And since we get data, sometimes we're able to just do that on the computer, but a lot of times people will fill out paper and pencil questionnaires, so they have to do the data entry. If we videotape interactions, then you'll help analyze those. And then you'll also, with some guidance from me and from the graduate students, you're going to help us review the literature, and we're going to help you understand what it is that you're reviewing. In animal research, you might be, usually you'll start off with sort of handling the animals, putting them into their test chambers, taking them out. As you get more advanced, you might be able to help with some of the surgeries. So those of you who are interested in a medical career, this is good experience for that. With animal research, they often do behavioral tests, or you might be doing tissue collection. So you might be working with brain slices, analyzing videos if it's behavioral, and then again, like going down to an even deeper level and going to molecular techniques. So taking a look and saying, all right, where exactly is this molecule working in the brain? And then in many cases, you might work, especially now, with existing data. So one of the things that's, I think COVID has been a silver lining of COVID, is that it led a lot of people to share their data online. And so any of us now can go through and say, okay, you asked this question with your data, I want to analyze it in an entirely new way and come up with a whole new question. So one of my thesis students did this. She, took an existing study and then said, okay, well, I'm going to do a combination of analyzing people's data from before COVID, and then I'm going to contact as many people as I can and see what their experience is like during COVID and compare the changes between those two. So exactly what you'll be doing will vary a lot by the lab. So usually before you get hired for a lab, there will be a pretty extensive interview process. And just remember, it's an interview both ways. So you want to find out what you're going to be doing in the lab, and are you going to be getting the experience that you want to get? Sometimes lab meeting attendance is required. It's usually a good idea to go even if it's not required, because this is really where you see the behind the scenes. So this is where people, graduate students come in and say, hey, I have this new study idea. What do you all think? Or here's the results that I found so far. Here's what I think they mean. Is there anything that I'm missing? So you'll really kind of see what it's like being a graduate student and how the experiments work that way. In many cases, it can result in a senior honors thesis. And that thesis might result in a publication, which is really cool, because then you get to be like, okay, I have officially now added to the body of knowledge out in the world. And in many cases, again, depending on the lab, in my lab, I really encourage people to build their skills because it's good for them and it's good for us.
So to give you guys another example of what this might look like, I'm going to talk a little bit about the lab that I'm a part of, the Personality Relationships and Hormones Lab. So we talked a little bit about how the hierarchy of different labs looks different. And so for my lab, there are two principal investigators or two sort of professors here at University of Michigan who work together, Dr. Edelstein and Dr. Gordon. And our lab really focuses on studying close relationships, romantic relationships especially. So we have these two principal investigators, we have a lab manager, me and a couple of other grad students, and then a lot of undergrad research assistants or RAs. And in this lab, RAs have a bunch of different responsibilities. So we meet together as a group every week and either hear about different research projects going on in the lab or have sort of those skill development workshops. So undergraduate RAs are encouraged to attend those. And then research assistants in the lab work on different little studies. So sometimes we have in-person studies where we'll actually bring couples into the lab and we'll have them complete tasks together. And so we need undergraduate research assistants to just walk the couples through to help set up equipment, clean up afterwards, teach them how to like take saliva samples and things like that. We also have research assistants working on literature reviews. So again, going back to what do we know already in the body of research about a particular topic, sometimes undergraduate research assistants can help us with that. We also do some coding of videos. So we have those couples come into the lab, they complete activities. Then we want to go back and see how did they interact with each other? Did they seem upset? Were they grateful? And so we have RAs help us sort of go back through those videos and understand what's going on. Because our lab also studies hormones, we also deal with saliva samples. So research assistants might be involved in actually being in the lab and helping assay saliva samples to look at different levels of hormones. And again, there's so many different tasks. Research assistants have helped sort of delivering kits to different participants' houses, lots of random things, but there are many cool projects sort of going on in the lab, and it kind of gives you an idea of what your research involvement might look like in an example lab here at University of Michigan. So we've talked a lot about research so far and what research looks like in the lab, what your role might be, but what are kind of the ways that you can use these skills and this information outside of the lab? So there are a lot of different options. So again, I just talked about my lab specifically. And so sort of recent grad students who have been in the lab have gone on to do a couple of different things. So some people have gone to work in industry. So for example, doing research in user experience at Google. So that was someone who graduated just last year is now doing that. Other people have gone into more academic roles. So being a psychology professor at Michigan State, being a postdoc, which is sort of doing additional research after you've completed your PhD. So doing that again at University of Michigan, but you can take these skills and apply them to different departments. So it doesn't just have to be in psychology. Some people will go work in public health or, the Institute of Social Research. And then some people lean towards more teaching-oriented roles, such as working as a faculty instructor at the University of San Francisco. So we'll be talking a little bit later in our workshop series about kind of the different things you can do with a PhD. For me, I really like teaching and mentoring, so I'm kind of leaning towards the instructor, liberal arts college role. But at the PhD level, there's a lot of different things you can use your skills for. And then we'll also talk about also as an undergrad, once you have research experience, you can use those skills in a lot of different ways as well.
So some of the reasons to get involved in research is that you pick up a lot of really great skills. I mean, it just gives you a whole new way of understanding not just the information that you're learning in your classes, but also what you hear about on the news, and just even how things work in real life. It sort of helps you develop your curiosity and your thinking around that. It helps you define what a problem area is. So even if you, let's say, decide to go in a completely different area and decide, oh, I think I'm going to go into, I want to run my own business instead. Well, if you run a business, problems are going to come up. You have to analyze those problems. You have to develop solutions. You have to be able to evaluate evidence and ideas. Same thing if you're going to be a doctor, like this is pretty much what you're doing all day, just on a different set of information. And you're going to pick up all those skills as a part of being in a lab. And then interpersonal skills as well. Again, in almost everything that we do today, I guess maybe one small exception is, if you become a famous writer, maybe you can go ahead and, lock yourself away in a closet. But even then, eventually you're going to have to work with your agent and your editor. We're always communicating, collaborating. And sometimes that means, having to be a little patient, especially working with participants. You want to be listening to what's going on with them to make sure they're having a good experience, make sure that their data is what you're thinking it is. You're going to learn about responsibility. You are responsible in many cases for making sure that study goes right. Or, if you're in the lab and you notice the computer isn't working, rather than just saying, oh, well, you're responsible for emailing the lab manager, the grad student, and saying, hey, so this computer is like sounding really loud. We might really want to look into that. And it's just a way of kind of developing that ethos of, okay, if I see something that's going wrong, then I'm going to fix it. Or even better, if I see a way to make things better than they were before, let me go ahead and take action on that. Again, the possibilities are really endless in terms of where you end up for a job. So graduates from our program, a lot of them actually stay here at Michigan. So so some of you may be familiar with CRLT. So we have a cognition science, CCN graduate who works there and who helps do the evaluations for your classes and things like that. A lot of our folks work at Google, at Netflix, Mayo Clinic. Actually, our biggest employer from psychology is Meta, Facebook or Meta. And actually, my very first graduate student, for those of you who've ever used Facebook Marketplace, she runs that. I have another graduate student who is basically running Amazon's customer service group over in Germany. A lot of people work in hospitals, or you can work at charitable foundations. So really, a lot of what you can do is endless. And it's not only about what you can do for a job, but the impact that you can have. So I'm just going to give you a couple of historical examples, and some that are less historical, about people who really made an impact through their work. So a big one, one of the reasons that our schools are no longer segregated is because of the work of Mamie Phipps Clark. Like, her work was actually cited in the Brown versus Board of Education case. Raiko True, so she does a lot of work on equal access to mental health care. So that's her academic work. And then she was able to use that to help create the first mental health center in California that serves Asian Americans. Likewise, George Sanchez, he himself got his start in very low income public schools in rural Arizona, made his way up through college. At one point, he was actually the director of the Venezuelan Ministry of Education. And then he came back to the US and campaigned against unfair treatment of minority children in New Mexico's education system, made a lot of changes to their education system. And as many of you will find out when we talk about graduate school applications, you may have heard the GRE, so a big test that's often used, or at least used to be often used for college admission or for graduate school admissions. A lot of places are no longer doing that. He sort of laid the groundwork for the science that led to a lot of institutions abandoning that, because he took a look at intelligence tests and started examining the ways in which they might be biased and be actually not very good measures. Somebody who is still extremely active, Jennifer Aberhart. So she does a lot of work on racial bias in policing. So that has been on a lot of our minds recently. And so she goes forth and she testifies to Congress and so on, and helps to shape laws and policies around that to help us improve that situation. And then I always like ending with Neil. So Neil is actually a University of Michigan alumnus. So he graduated from our psychology program, and he's now an assistant professor at Cornell. If you want to Google him, he's like super famous. He writes for 538. He frequently writes for The Atlantic, Washington Post. And he actually served on the presidential committee to try to address racial disparities and health inequities in how COVID-19 treatments were being rolled out. More locally, he also worked on this thing called Lansing Saves, which is a really cool program for Lansing that helps lower income students start an automatic savings account from kindergarten. It also gives them and their families financial education, and also helps them stay motivated so that they can use that to end up going to the college that they want to go to. So, if you stay focused, you can make a lot of change. And these are all people with degrees in psychology.
So if you hear all of us and you're like, okay, I'm convinced, research sounds amazing, but how do I get involved? Well, there's a lot of different avenues that you can do this. So one, programs like Star Scholars really help you prepare. So it's kind of an exposure program. So especially if you want to join in the winter semester, we really try to give you in-depth skills and knowledge and practice so that you can be really ready to find and get different research opportunities. There are also programs that sort of pair you up in a research lab more directly. So at University of Michigan, UROP and SROP are really great programs. SROP is sort of in the summer. UROP, I believe, is mainly for freshmen or junior transfers. But these are programs sort of designed to get people who maybe don't have research experience connected with these different labs. There are also open listings at the psychology research portal. So the different labs in the psychology department, if they're looking for undergrad research assistants, they'll sort of post an opportunity and you can browse through those and apply on this research portal. And then the other suggestion would be generally just making connections. So particularly if you have a class and you really are interested in the topic, or maybe your professor or GSI talks a little bit about the research they do and you think it's really cool, I encourage you guys to go to their office hours and start establishing those connections. Sometimes you can ask if they have openings, if they, sort of have opportunities for undergrads, but even just starting the conversation and showing your interest in what they do, showing that you're sort of proactive and reaching out is a great way to sort of open the door. And then also Star Scholars will be having another session on October 26th that's specifically about how to get involved in research and sort of what to do if you can't find a research opportunity this year. So if this is something you're interested in, we encourage you guys to come back for that session as well. Also, something I hear sometimes is people will be like, I would love to get involved in research, but I have so many classes I need to take. Like I'm, doing all these other things. How am I possibly going to have time? And one thing that can help is there are actually ways at University of Michigan that you can get course credit for participating in research. So I won't go into all of the details for these, but Psych 326, basically, if you sort of find a research lab that's willing to do this with you, you can get credits for just doing research with them. And it can also count as sort of this experimental lab requirement for psychology and BCN majors. And then Psych 331 is another option that can sort of can count for some of these requirements as well. And so we include the link to kind of find more information about these course credits if there's something you're interested in. Great. And at this point, that's all of the main sort of information that we had for you guys, but we have a lot of time if there are questions. And again, we have the information for our email and for the website here. I did see someone asked about getting the slides at the end of session. Cindy, do we have I know that this session will be recorded and posted.
Yeah, so it'll take Jyoti a couple of days to get to edit the session. But I believe she will then email you guys all out the YouTube link to it. So you can review it again later.
Great. Any other questions?
And if something does come up, especially for those of you who are U of M students, I'm actually the Associate Chair for Undergrad Studies here. This is the new position we created that is specifically devoted to you all. So anything that I can do to help, I'm here for it. So let me also then just remind you that this is just one part of a larger series. So you can check this one off your list, but we hope to see you also at the other ones. And if you are a Michigan student, we encourage you to apply for our winter mentoring program. And then this is something that just came up yesterday. So one of the things that if you go into psychology, as I said, you end up doing a lot of things. And one of my other hats is being on the fMRI Labs Executive Committee. So they have an opportunity on Monday the 26th for a class. They would like a demo participant. So if you would like to go over to the fMRI lab, meet Dr. Genius, who does a lot of cool work with ADHD and brain imaging. You can get a picture of your brain, $20 an hour. If you're interested in that, then email me and I will hook you up with him. All right, we'll hang out for a little while just in case somebody has any other questions, but other than that, hope you guys have a wonderful afternoon.